Would you want to be Ernest Hemingway if you got all the fame, all of the genius, but you had to take the shotgun as well? Of course, you'd get to be your own version. Your life wouldn't be just an imitation of his, but your life would have all of his characteristics. This means you get to be a genius artist, one who's renowned in your own lifetime, and an icon within the culture. But you also have to live constantly feeling the pull of your own gun, shouldering an emptiness that no accolade can fill. I think Hemingway is a great symbol for the tortured artist archetype, and this question is worth pondering for anybody who's ever wrestled with the feeling of wanting to be great. Through it, we're going to explore questions relating to meaning, narrative, and the necessity of suffering. For nearly my whole life, I believe that suffering and greatness were bound up together, and it brought me some great opportunities. But now, I want to propose some radically different answers to that question. But before we talk about that, let's walk through the question so we know what's really at stake. Let's talk about Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway was a monumental figure in 20th century literature. He penned masterworks that saw him renowned in his lifetime with a legacy that stretches out far beyond it. He won Pulitzer and Nobel Prizes for his writing. He was friends with many of the most prominent writers of the 20th century, with his friends including the likes of people like Gertrude Stein, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Ezra Pound. Beyond this too, he was a symbol of swagger in the public imagination. He was an idol of masculinity. He'd been deep-sea fishing in the Caribbean, he'd been on African savannas, he had a passion for bullfighting, he'd been a war correspondent. He could regale anybody with countless stories about his daring adventures out there in the world. Hemingway was handsome and iconic. He was like if Brad Pitt had a Pulitzer Prize. But he was a deeply troubled man. His childhood was marked by beatings. His father whipped him relentlessly and detested his literary work, and his mother lorded over him like a tyrant. Both of his parents likely had undiagnosed mental disorders, leading to a conflict-filled childhood. Tragically, two of Ernest's own siblings would take their own lives, and so too would his father, an event which Ernest describes as though it was his own life being shot out from under him. This only exacerbated his already intense drinking habit. Beneath his machismo and brilliance lay rampant self-destruction and isolation, through which many of his adventures begin to read more like the desperate attempts of a scared man to outrun himself. He couldn't sleep at night in the darkness because he was traumatized by the war, and the dark reminded him of the shrapnel. He was an alcoholic who battled bipolar and depression in an age where such disorders were scarcely seen as real, and even less real for a man such as he. His intensity of life that powered his writing also seemed to erode his relationships. He was married 4 times and was in frequent battles with his friends, often surprising people with a sudden, seemingly inexplicable outburst. The biographer James Mello recounts how incisively cruel and derisive Ernest could be to those around him. So while his peers marveled at his genius, they could see that beneath the rugged and manly exterior lay somebody who was far more lonely, fearful, and volatile than he let on. All of this was compounded by frequent injury and numerous head traumas. Combine this with decades of alcoholism, and in his old age he developed a form of dementia, stripping from him his 2 most prized possessions, his memories and his ability to write. During this period, Ernest would break down at his typewriter, unable to summon the words that had meant so much to him. And ultimately, unable to live in his own mind, Ernest ended his own life. His was a life of awe of everything that is grand and monumental. Even the end of his life had a poetic flavor to it, going out the same way his father did. And now I ask you again, would you want to be Ernest Hemingway? You could have all of the genius, all of the swagger, all of the mythology. You could write words that would shake the foundations of literature. You could live a life so large that it would become a legend. But it comes with a price. That inescapable darkness. Would you do it? Many would say yes. Many have said yes. The idea of the tortured artist runs deeply throughout our culture. We've been taught that same sensitivity that makes one so artful is the same sensitivity that's going to bring one tremendous suffering and pain, that genius is somehow linked to madness, that in order to make something profound you must be willing to destroy yourself. I understand this belief because for many years I lived it. I believe that pain was the source of all of my creativity, all of my ambition, that anything worth doing in the world would require taking on the mantle of Hemingway. That torment was just the price of admission you had to pay if you wanted any shot of doing something worthwhile. And after spending practically my whole life living this way, I noticed something shocking. I saw how I had trained myself to live from a place of pain. I loved the idea of art and ambition so much that I would do anything for it. And so I connected in my mind my own suffering to my capacity to create. And because I believed this, I taught myself to suffer. But one day I saw exactly what I had done to myself. And I saw how there was this inner child within me, this thing which loved creation from an earnest place that I was lording over like a tyrannical parent. The thing is, you cannot win a war against yourself. The lash that you use for motivation will mark you. You bear every single scar that you inflict. I had driven myself to a place where every third or fourth night I'd go to bed silently hoping I wouldn't wake up in the next morning so I wouldn't have to go through it all again. I couldn't believe how deeply I had betrayed myself, how much I'd professed to care about creativity, and yet how cruelly I was treating that part of myself that longed to create. And ever since seeing that, I've made a commitment that no matter what, I am not going to hate myself anymore. So if you offered me Hemingway's life, all of the brilliance and all the brutality, I would say no. And if you told me that that was the only path to greatness, I would still say no, because I have made the commitment to care for myself. But here's the thing, was any of this ever true? Do you need to torment yourself to be great? What if Hemingway succeeded not because of his self-destruction, but in spite of it? Because we know that it is possible to do amazing and creative things without such vitriol. Lately, I've been so inspired by people like Andrew Wiles, the mathematician who solved Fermat's last theorem, a monolithic achievement in the field of mathematics. He worked in solitude for 7 years, driven not by torment but by an earnest love of mathematics. Here's Wiles talking about his journey.
I loved every minute of it. However hard it had been, there'd been setbacks often, there'd been things that had seemed insurmountable, but it was a kind of private and very personal battle I was engaged in. It was so indescribably beautiful. It was so simple and so elegant. And I just stared in disbelief for 20 minutes. Then during the day I walked around the department. I'd keep coming back to my desk and looking to see it was still there, it was still there. I had this very rare privilege of being able to pursue in my adult life what had been my childhood dream. I know it's a rare privilege, but if one can do this, it's more rewarding than anything I could imagine.
Stories like his and many others make me wonder if the tragedy of Ernest Hemingway wasn't really his death, but that he never found another way. I don't see why greatness must demand destruction. I'd like for this to be a remnant of an older time, like how Hemingway couldn't seek treatment for his mental disorders because of societal biases. What if we now are prevented from seeking greatness through love because of our own societal biases? Greatness asks for devotion, and for sensitivity, and for discipline. But where does it ask for death? So perhaps this question is a test. Would you want to be Ernest Hemingway? The answer is perhaps not a yes or a no. It's the recognition that we don't have to choose between greatness and wholeness. That in our own wildest imaginations, we can imagine a world where we create from a fierce self-compassion rather than a twisted self-vengeance. That is what I would like to believe, at least.